Kira. My name is Melissa. I just started here 2 months ago. I am a relativity solutions specialist on the solutions team, more commonly known as the advice team. So you kind of hear the two names used. It's been the advice team for a long time, but we're kind of rebranding into the solutions team. So just to give you a little background, I've been in the eDiscovery industry for just over 13 years now. I started as a paralegal at a law firm, moved into litigation support, which we'll kind of talk about what that is, and then I moved to Chicago, started working for a vendor. I'll kind of explain what a vendor is later too, and I was hosting relativity there. And then, like I said, 2 months ago, I started here at Kira. So, let's take into the first slide. Basically, the goal of the training is just to give a high-level understanding. We're not going to go in depth into anything. Just want you to kind of understand, what eDiscovery is in terms of how relativity plays into it, and kind of how the products that we offer impact our clients' litigation needs and the litigation process. So before I kind of get really into depth into the slides, I'm kind of going to talk about what discovery is. So you'll hear the word discovery. Most of the law shows you might watch on TV, Law and Order or The Good Wife or something like that, they don't really talk about this. You see something happen, and then all of a sudden they're in trial, and it seems like maybe a couple days or a week has passed. That's not the real world. Typically, a lawsuit is going to take months, if not years, and most times it's going to take years. So the big portion of that process is the discovery phase. So this is where, I get a complaint filed, which is basically what starts the litigation process. And through the course of this, we're going to look at the GM ignition defect, product defect case. So if I'm one of the attorneys for a GM, and all of a sudden I get a lawsuit filed against me saying you have this ignition switch defect and it injured a bunch of people, I'm going to have to go back and say, okay, let me identify the key engineers that worked on this initiative and get all the data they have. I need to discover what data they have. I might need to discover what the company as a whole has. Do we have certain policies or marketing materials that would have been related to this? So I'm going to go into my company and discover what we have. At the same time, say Jenna's with the plaintiff's firm, she's going to go to her clients and discover their information. So if they were injured, it might be going and getting their medical records and going through that just to see what documents does she have. So that's kind of where the discovery term comes from, is we want to discover what each side has. So kind of once you get there, you're going to exchange that information. Well, back in the old days, even when I started in litigation, most of that was done in paper. So I would go and I would give Jenna a baker's box full of paper that she would have to go through with her litigation team. Gets pretty cumbersome. So then in the 90s was really kind of when eDiscovery came into play, or electronic discovery. Everybody had email. People were storing things on hard drives. So that was a whole untapped area that we needed to get into in the litigation process, was getting that electronic discovery, because we were missing out on a lot of stuff if we were just going by paper. So basically, you would go and I'd say to my engineers, okay, well now I need to get all your emails, I need to get your hard drive, and that information to share it with Jenna or the other attorneys working on the matter. So that's kind of where we evolved, and that's definitely where relativity comes into play, because you need a place to put that data. Because before we had something like relativity or other document review platforms, you get, I'm sorry, I know this is a mouse, but if we pretend it's a hard drive, you get that hard drive, and I have 10 other attorneys working with me, and they may not all be here in Chicago. So if I have to send a hard drive to New York and a hard drive to DC and one to California and Texas, everybody has a copy, but we're all doing our own thing. So attorney A opens a document and starts making notes on a spreadsheet. Same thing for all the other attorneys. So if there's 11 of us working on it, we could be making different notes on 11 different spreadsheets, and how do you reconcile that? So it became kind of a nightmare when you're trying to figure out how do we all get together And if I said something was relevant to the matter and somebody else said it wasn't, I may not know that until months down the line and we're not all on the same page. So relativity comes into play in that now you can put all your documents in one place. And it is one of many document review platforms that are out there in the industry. So kind of on that note, just like you might have a bunch of different browsers, IE, Safari, Chrome, there's a lot of different document review platforms. I'll send a follow-up email after this with the slide deck, so please don't really need to take notes. And it'll list kind of some of the other document review platforms that are competitors in the market. And just to give you a little background if you ever want to look into that. But then once I have a hard drive, how do I get it into relativity? So I'd like to say you can just plug it in, but you basically have to move the data into a file share, and then you point relativity processing to it. And this is a great thing of relativity, it has a processing component. And when I say processing, it's a way to normalize the data so that you can actually look at it. So it's taking those native files, so you have a Word document, an Excel, a PDF, and it's normalizing it so that you can look at it in relativity or in whatever document review platform you would be using. So that's kind of the processing part of it, and there's a lot of processing engines out there too. So relativity isn't the only one that does processing. But then once the data is normalized, the attorneys can review it right there in relativity. They don't have to have Microsoft Word and Adobe and everything else on their computers, because relativity will let you view it without necessarily having to launch the application it was created in. So that's a great part, because then all those attorneys all over the US that need to see these documents have one centralized location. And if I make a comment on a document, I say this is a hot document, it's key to our case, one of the other attorneys might be like, I don't agree with you, I don't think this is actually really helpful. And we can do that in real time, and I can see their comments to what I'm doing and vice versa. So it's really helpful in kind of bringing everything together so that we're not all doing our own thing and then trying to reconcile at the end. Any questions so far? I know that was kind of like a diatribe.
That's pretty good though.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So what is litigation? It's basically a dispute between two parties, and you're going to see there's a lot of different litigation. Kind of what I'll reference today with the GM is product defect, but you can see any of these, as well as obviously you'll have criminal matters come into play. So the players in litigation, most of us know the vast majority of these, and there's two that I'm going to focus on, but pretty much everybody has seen the plaintiff and the defendant, if you've watched any law shows or law movies, and the judge and the jury. Corporate counsel is going to be the in-house counsel for a corporation or a company. And then your outside counsel is actually usually going to be a sole practitioner or a law firm. So quite often, so in this example, GM, we may only have a couple in-house attorneys, so we're going to hire a big law firm someplace else that can actually handle the case for us. So we'll work in conjunction with them, but they'll take on the brunt of it, so we'll hire them to do this for us. Two that I really want to touch on, though, are litigation support specialists and contract attorneys, because those are the two groups that impact us the most. So contract attorneys, they became, I guess, popular, if you want to use that word, in the 2000s. Unfortunately, when the market got bad and the economy went down, there were a lot of attorneys that ended up out of work, as well as a lot of people in other industries. And then you had a lot of people graduating from law school, and there were no jobs. So there was this huge market of unemployed attorneys. And some of them did become lit support specialists, but this was an area that big law firms were able to tap into, because here I am as GM, and I have this case that has millions of documents that have to be looked at. And I hired this big fancy law firm, but they charge $350 to $500 an hour. Well, I don't want them sitting in front of a computer, looking at a document, clicking that it's importance of case or not, and paying them $350 to $500 an hour. So I say, I want I want a big law firm to take care of this, but you need to find some attorneys that can review this at a lower rate. So what they would do is they would hire contract attorneys, and they would be contracted just for that project. And they might be able to pay them $60 an hour, and then the attorney is actually making maybe $30 an hour. So definitely cuts down the cost for everybody involved. And these attorneys get to sit in front of Relativity and click documents and click save and next. The one problem with the contract attorneys is if a case settles, you might have been hired on for a 6-month project, and 2 months into it, they settle the case and it goes away, and now you're out of work again. So not necessarily an extremely lucrative career. So that's why a lot of contract attorneys actually got into litigation support. Litigation support specialists are our biggest friends. They're also the people that we probably talk to and deal with the most. They're the ones that are going to be selling Relativity to their attorneys, why we need to use it, why we need to use the functions within it. They're the ones that administer it, and they know the front end, back end. They're pretty much running the case and advising their attorneys on how to do things as well. So they're the ones that'll be coming to our trainings and all the fun stuff that we do here at KKR. The other, any questions? So many of you, or some of you, may have seen this before. This is the electronic discovery reference model, the eDRM. So basically, Relativity is now meant to cover pretty much all of this. Information management is probably the only area we haven't delved into yet. So when you go into identification, that's kind of the part where I'm identifying my engineers and the documents that I have that might be relevant to a litigation. Preservation is basically saying, okay, I know who the key players are. I need to maintain those documents so that nobody's going back to their office and all of a sudden deleting data, or in the old days shredding paper. So I want to preserve it and make sure it doesn't go anywhere. If you don't preserve your data, you will get in trouble with the courts. So it's a key thing to do.
And chucking your phone in the river doesn't get rid of it.
Exactly. It's stored somewhere in the cloud. And then of course, once I identify that data, we've preserved it, I need to collect it. So I need to get it from the hard drive, the laptop, your email. And then of course, what I kind of touched on earlier, we need to process that data, review it, analyze it, eventually provide it to the other side in a production. And then the presentation piece would be either taking it to trial or a mediation or arbitration or some sort of way to settle the dispute. Any questions on the EDRM? I will tell you, just be careful when you're talking about the EDRM, is don't call it the EDRM model. I've gotten my hands slapped before for that. It's like, oh, the electronic discovery reference model, yeah. So again, a dispute basically kicks off the litigation, and that's what starts things moving forward. Again, in the GM case, GM hired a large law firm basically to support them in the matter. And this is what I referred to earlier, a complaint. So this is what is filed by the plaintiff's side to basically start the litigation process. And then General Motors would respond in an answer to that complaint, basically acknowledging or denying all the counts that are basically presented against them. So this usually is a pretty quick process, but it can go back and forth if there are counterclaims. The court does order that the two sides do have to meet and confer. So they'll get together and see, is this something that we can quickly resolve, or is this going to have to move forward? Are we going to have to go through the discovery process and production and potentially some sort of resolution? During the time when the two parties meet, that's usually when they'll talk about how are we going to exchange data. I can tell you, when I was still working in a law firm, my attorneys used to agree with the other side that we're just gonna keep providing paper to each other. We don't wanna do this whole eDiscovery thing, it's too scary. Nowadays, you can't get away with that. There's too many federal rules that basically say you have to also do eDiscovery. But at that time too, you can say, well, I want my stuff provided to me in this way with this metadata and these parameters. So all that is hashed out as meet and confer settlement or conference.
A lot of people were pretty upset when we upgraded in 9.2 and you couldn't print directly from relatives anymore. So many like old attorneys still want the documents printed out. It's so funny.
Yeah, I worked a case where we had 36 4-inch binders of exhibits, and each arbitrator wanted a copy. So I had to send 36 4-inch binders to be copied and make 2 additional sets. And that wasn't that long ago. I mean, that was 2006.
Yeah. Well, I did that like last month. I mean, people still want paper. It's insane.
Yeah. So it's not going away as quickly as we would like, but Relativity is trying to push it that everything stays electronic and not paper.
Well, those docs came from Relativity, most of them.
Personnel.
Yeah.
Yeah, that may never change.
Yeah.
So, basically you go through a disclosure process and you submit disclosure statements to each other. And in those disclosure statements, you're going to identify the key people and the key documents. So your custodians, your witnesses, and any key materials you may have. Now, custodians and witnesses aren't necessarily the same person. So my engineers are going to be witnesses. They worked on the product, they designed the product. They may also be custodians because they're probably going to have documentation around the ignition switch and what they were doing. But you could also have a custodian that isn't a witness. So say my engineers send some of their documentation to somebody who puts together the manuals on the vehicles. So they're adding in that ignition switch portion. That person probably has no information on the design, the architecture. All they were doing was putting together the manuals. So we may still collect their data. We may collect their email or what they have on their hard drive, but they're not necessarily going to be a witness that is deposed or goes to trial and gives testimony. But you still have to obviously identify all those people. You can also get information from each side by doing a request for production. So, Genevieve with the plaintiff, she says, okay, I want all the documentation on those vehicles, makes, model, and years. And I may come back and say, well, the Saturn Ion wasn't involved. There were no ignition switch issues with the Saturn Ion, and the Chevy Cobalt, the issues were the 2006 and 2007. So I'm not giving you those other documents. This is where the discovery process can really get drawn out. Because if I say no, then we're probably going to take it to the judge in motions and fight back and forth on if they should or should not get that documentation. So again, this is why months can turn into years for the litigation process. And again, just talking about the custodians and witnesses, a little bit differences, but then a deposition. So you have these people who have key information on the ignition switch. And so I want to get their sworn testimony, but we can do this in a deposition. So it's transcribed by a court reporter and it's given under oath and signed off by, and the witness does sign the final transcript, basically to authenticate that it is a true replication of their sworn testimony. So these are great because you can find out, okay, did I just find out some key information that's going to really help my case or potentially really hurt my case? So this really helps you decide, maybe I really need to settle, or I have a really great case, I want to take this to trial. And then the depositions, because they are sworn testimony under oath, that can be used during trial. Sometimes it's fought about if it can or can't, but that can be key. It can also be key because then if discovery and the litigation process drags out for years, I had a situation where somebody we deposed was no longer living, and so we could then use their deposition at trial because we could not actually call them live. So it's something very powerful that we have in the litigation process. Nowadays too, most of the times they're video recorded, which can come in real handy when you have a plaintiff who's claiming a major injury, but the entire time during their deposition, you know, their arm that was hurt so bad they have no problem swinging around. Okay. And so then kind of during the review phase, so we have all the documents in relativity, and the attorneys are looking at them. So they're going to see, are these relevant to the litigation? You know, are they responsive? Are they confidential? Are they between the attorney and the client that there's some sort of privilege to be claimed? So they're going to look through the documents and make those coding decisions. And the nice thing about relativity is you have a panel, you basically just point and click, you save, and those decisions are there. So all my other attorneys can go in and say, okay, here are all the relevant documents or responsive, here are the documents that are privileged and we're not going to give to the other side. So it really streamlines the process to decide what is relevant to the case. Privileged documents too, just to kind of touch a little bit more on those. You may have documents where you still provide it to the other side, but maybe you redact some information. So, you know, for the plaintiffs, for example, they might have their social security numbers on medical records. You want to remove that information. So relativity also allows you to put on a little redaction, so you can basically mark out that information so that you're not providing it to the other side. Same thing if you had like credit card information or any banking information, that stuff that you would, you know, redact out, but that document can still be provided to the other side. So it's partially privileged, basically. And then production that I've talked about. So, you know, we've asked for the other side request for production of certain documents. So when you actually give it to the other side, you're going to give it to them in a format that you've agreed upon. Industry standard is TIFF images. So basically what we do is we take your Word document or your email, and within Relativity, we created an image of it, which is basically a picture of each page. Once you have the TIFFs generated, or those images, you can brand them. And basically what that means is if these documents are confidential, I can put the word confidential on the lower left-hand corner of every page of every document to identify confidentiality. You're usually on industry standards, typically the lower right-hand corner, you're going to put what they call a Bates number. And basically it's a way to reference the document. So, you know, if you went to court and I have, you know, 50 documents that I plan to use during trial, and they're not numbered, it's really hard to say, okay, well, can you find, you know, the document that starts with when Jim walked into the room? It's going to be really hard. So this is a way to easily identify the documents and reference them. So, you know, if you have 30 attorneys and, you know, in a deposition, everybody knows what you're talking about. So ease of reference, definitely easier for organization, especially when an attorney goes, could you find this one page? And if they can reference the Bates number, it's much easier. But these are all things that can be done within the Relativity production module, so it's really great. And then analysis. Relativity has different portions to it. Analytics and assisted review, basically, that can help attorneys through the analysis process, basically speed up the process or give them another way to look at it. So. And again, just going back to what Relativity does. So review, analysis, and production, that's the core. That's where Relativity started. I started on Relativity 6.9, and that's all we had. So we definitely expanded throughout the years. Relativity Legal Hold more so just does identification and preservation. Collection's kind of its own thing now, but it's in that whole realm of kind of pulling all that information together to get it ready for processing and then review. Again, the processing, it's based on invariance, and I don't have a lot of information on that to give you. And then presentation, currently Relativity has binders that's being phased out, and there's going to be something else put into play that's in the works right now. But that's really talking about once you take it to either arbitration or trial to present it. So there are a couple other presentation tools out there that I know I used when I did trials. Information management, we don't really have anything for that. That's normally what a company will set up internally to say, what's my retention policy for documents, how long should I hold them, kind of how am I going to manage my data in-house. So we kind of come after that point.
For the collection portion, we never used it. Is it just a way to track the collections? It's not actually assisting with collecting documents, is it?
I don't think so, but I'm not 100% up on the collections
I'll find
but
out.
yeah. Because it's kind of, I mean, now it's going to be tied into ECA, and ECA is early case assessment. So in Relativity 9.4, there's the ECA and collections piece. And early case assessment is basically being able to look at your data before you push it to review and cull it down even further. So maybe instead of 1 million documents, you can get it down to 300,000 because you're able to weed stuff out, through some of Relativity's other features. So.
Which is the new big thing.
Yes.
It's like whatever, someone search terms and get rid of documents that don't hit and take filters, and a lot of people use analytics to identify documents that are conceptually similar.
Yeah,
But
and
that's
that's
like the biggest.
and it's huge for them to save money.
Yeah.
Because it culls down everything in advance, so they don't spend the time reviewing stuff.
The corporations are really pushing that. Now the law firms aren't as into it yet, but they're being pushed into
Yes.
it.
Absolutely.
So that'll be a big thing.
And then, again, your methods for resolution can vary: settlement, arbitration, mediation, and trial. And I'm talking really fast so I can finish up early and get you guys out of here sooner. But any questions and anything at all about litigation, eDiscovery, Relativity? I'll try my best.
Who do you think Relativity's biggest competitor is?
Gosh, I don't even know right now. I mean, Relativity really
It's
is the gorilla in the room right now. Especially because it has so many different components to it. So there's not a lot of document review platforms that have all the functions built into it that Relativity does. So when I was at the law firm, I used 2 different review platforms, both summation and concordance. And neither of them have like a processing component to them, or everything is kind of a one